It was the sweltering midpoint of 1968, deep within the emerald shadows of Phuoc Tuy province, when the world narrowed down to the space between a heartbeat and a trigger pull. A patrol of the Australian SAS moved through the undergrowth not as men, but as shifting textures of green and brown, their presence entirely absorbed by the ancient, indifferent canopy. There were 6 of them, their faces painted in jagged streaks of charcoal and olive, their heavy combat boots meticulously wrapped in damp cloth to muffle the percussion of every single footfall. Not a single sound escaped their formation, not a metallic click, not a heavy breath, and not a ripple of unnatural movement betrayed their presence. They had been tracking faint, anomalous signs for 4 days, signs that whispered of a presence that did not belong to the heavy-booted regular infantry. There were footprints too small and light to be male, a singular smudge of cigarette ash where no Allied patrol should have rested, and, most tellingly, the ghost of a scent, cheap floral soap carried on a humid, stagnant breeze. At first, the lead scout thought it was a sophisticated North Vietnamese trick, a lure designed to draw them into a kill zone. But then, in a small, sun-dappled clearing near a trickling stream, they found her. She was young, barely out of her teenage years, with streaks of dried mud highlighting the sharp angles of her face. When she saw the ghosts in the trees, her eyes became wide and wild with a primal, electric fear. Her hands trembled violently as she reached for a cloth-wrapped satchel slung over her shoulder. The SAS operators raised their weapons in a unified mechanical motion, but they did not fire. There was no shout, no sudden burst of adrenaline-fueled violence. Instead, one trooper stepped forward, lowered his rifle slightly, and spoke in a firm but quiet voice that seemed to settle the air. "You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you." She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Slowly, almost as if her muscles were fighting against her will, she dropped the bag. Inside, the Australians found morphine ampules, a weathered notebook filled with meticulous hand-drawn maps of the surrounding ridges, and a small, rusted pistol that had clearly not been fired in weeks. She was a Viet Cong courier, perhaps a field medic or a scout for a larger local cell. But as the men looked at her, what struck them most was not her rank or the intelligence she might gather. It was the frantic terror in her eyes and the dark dirt packed under her fingernails. In the harsh light of the clearing, she looked less like a faceless enemy and more like someone's younger sister, or a daughter who had lost her way. They did not use plastic cuffs or heavy restraints. Instead, they gave her water. In that singular moment, the rigid boundary between captor and captive began to dissolve. It was not just a war anymore. It was 2 different kinds of people trying to survive the same indifferent landscape. She gave them the name Mai. Whether it was her true name or the name of a sister she had lost to a previous bombing raid remained a mystery. In the theater of war, names had a way of shifting like the shadows they inhabited, constantly trying to survive the harsh, unforgiving light of discovery. The men of the Australian SAS did not press her for details immediately. They had captured enemy soldiers before, hard, embittered men who spat at the soil and shouted revolutionary slogans through clenched teeth, even when facing a firing squad. But Mai was a different kind of challenge. She did not curse them, and she did not beg for her life. She simply sat quietly under the makeshift bamboo lean-to the patrol had constructed, clutching a threadbare, faded scarf and staring into the thick wall of the jungle, as if trying to remember the exact path back to her childhood. The interpreter, an ARVN sergeant who had seen too much death to be easily moved, spoke to her with a surprising, measured gentleness. Slowly, her story began to emerge from the silence. She was 19 years old, born in a small riverside village near the Mekong Delta. Her father had been conscripted by the South Vietnamese forces and had died in a botched ambush years earlier. Her mother had simply vanished during a sweep operation by regional forces, leaving Mai to be raised by an uncle, a school teacher who had traded his books for the life of a political cadre. By the age of 16, she had memorized the complex topography of the province and knew the code phrases of a dozen hidden cells. By 17, she was living in the jungle full-time, moving medical supplies and documenting the movements of the foreign troops. "I never shot anyone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I carried medicine. Sometimes I carried food. That was all I was told to do." One of the older troopers, a man who had likely been a farmer in Queensland before the draft claimed him, listened to her translation without a hint of judgment. He did not speak a word of Vietnamese, but he understood the universal language of exhaustion. When she finished speaking, he reached into his pack and placed a small, precious tin of condensed milk near her. She looked at the offering for a long time, her eyes darting between the tin and the man's painted face. Then, she gave a single dignified nod. It was not an act of thanks or an admission of submission. It was a simple recognition of humanity. Mai did not ask what the dawn would bring. She expected the worst: interrogation, detention, or the nameless horrors she had been warned about in the revolutionary training camps. What surprised her was the reality of her current situation. She was the enemy, but she was not being treated as a monster. They gave her space to sleep, a canteen of fresh water, and a heavy wool blanket when the wind turned cold and damp at night. As the rain dripped steadily from the massive teak trees, Mai sat among these foreign ghosts and wondered what kind of war she had actually been sent to fight. From the very second she had been surrounded, Mai had braced herself for pain. The political officers had been very clear. If captured by the Americans or their allies, she was to expect humiliation, beatings, and interrogation by fire. She had heard stories, some undoubtedly true, others bloated by the desperate fear of the camps. She had been told to bite her tongue until she bled, to resist every question, and to seek death before being taken. So when the tall men in camouflage stepped from the ferns, she had closed her eyes and waited for the first blow. But the blow never arrived. Instead, she found herself in the care of professionals who moved with a deliberate, haunting calm. They searched her with a clinical, detached thoroughness, removing the pistol and the satchel. One soldier found a tiny red diary in her pocket, but he did not rifle through it with mockery or show it to his comrades for a laugh. He simply tucked it into a secure pouch and said nothing. That night, as she watched them from behind her knees near a tiny camouflaged campfire, she saw that they barely spoke to one another. They moved like hunters, but they treated each other with an easy, quiet trust. The youngest among them, a boy who looked barely older than Mai herself, once left an open tin of meat beside her pack without saying a word. It was not kindness in the way she had been taught to understand it. It was something far more dangerous. It was a discipline of decency. She overheard the Arvin interpreter asking the patrol leader why he had not tied her hands. The soldier simply shrugged and looked into the dark. "If she runs, we will find her again. But until then, we show her we are not animals." That statement stayed with Mai longer than any revolutionary slogan. She had expected to be broken, but instead, they were giving her her dignity back, piece by piece. When she developed a persistent racking cough, they passed her a clean cloth. When her hands shook from the cold, they offered her more water. They were not fighting out of hatred. They were simply doing a job they had been sent to do, and somehow, that made it much harder for her to hate them back. Just before dawn on the fourth day, the jungle was wrapped in a thick silver mist that made every leaf look like a ghost. Most of the patrol was either snatching a few minutes of sleep or silently prepping their gear for the day's move. The patrol commander, a quiet man with gray beginning to show at his temples, sat down cross-legged beside Mai. He did not raise his voice or loom over her like an interrogator. Instead, he spoke in a slow, deliberate English that the interpreter translated softly. "I have a daughter," he began, his voice weary. "She would be about your age now. She used to braid flowers into her hair, and she hated the idea of me coming here. She thought I would die in someone else's war." Mai looked at him, her eyes finally meeting his without the veil of terror. "And do you think it is your war?" she asked. The commander nodded once, slowly. "I did not at first, but now I just try to keep my men alive. I do not hate you. I do not even know you. I just do the job." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a profound, heavy honesty. It disarmed her more than any threat of fire ever could. She surprised herself by replying, "I did not want to fight either, but they came to our village. They promised freedom. They promised revenge for my father. It is very hard to say no when everyone you know is saying yes." They sat in a shared silence for a long time, two people from opposite ends of a bloody battlefield staring at the same fog. He stood up slowly as the first light began to filter through the canopy. "You will be moved to the rear soon. I cannot say what will happen next, but I will make sure they know you were treated fairly." She did not thank him with words, but as he turned to leave, she whispered, "My name is not Mai. That was my sister's name. She died 2 years ago." The commander paused, turned back, and said gently, "Thank you for trusting me with that." On the 5th day, the sound of a helicopter began to pulse through the air, vibrating in the chests of everyone in the clearing. A transport would take Mai to a rear compound for formal processing. As she prepared to board, she noticed that the Australian who had seen her blisters had left a pair of worn, dry jungle boots near her feet. She hesitated, but eventually her aching soles made the choice for her. She laced them up, feeling the strange comfort of her enemy's gear. The patrol commander gave her a final brief nod, not as a victor to the vanquished, but as one survivor to another. The war did not stop. The jungle did not change its nature. But for those 5 days, there had been no villains and no heroes, only people sharing the same mud, the same hunger, and the same sky. As the helicopter lifted into the mist, Mai looked down and saw the 6 men already melting back into the green, disappearing before the rotors had even cleared the trees. She would go on to survive the war, eventually becoming a nurse in a small hospital, healing the same kinds of wounds she had once seen in the jungle. Years later, when her granddaughter asked her what had been the most terrifying part of the conflict, Mai did not speak of the bombs or the fire. She said, "The scariest moment was when I realized that the enemy I was taught to hate looked at me as a human being. I did not know what to do with that." She realized then that the most powerful act in war is not the shot fired, but the one withheld. В конечном итоге, то, что остается после того, как все флаги падут и имена исчезнут с мемориалов, это не то, кто победил или проиграл, а то, кто решил остаться человеком посреди тьмы. This was the legacy of the SAS in Phuoc Tuy, a discipline of restraint that was more subversive and more enduring than any weapon ever forged. Every year when the monsoon rains return, she pauses and remembers not the slogans, but the 6 painted faces in the trees and the quiet man who spoke of his daughter. It was not mercy. It was a choice to remain human, and that choice became the strongest shield she ever knew.